All right. Well, welcome to the fifth podcast for the fourth week of our 4-week Red Dead Redemption History and Ethics course. As I've ever been, this is Dr. Rob Byer in a kind of philosophy area. We also have my co-teacher and co-author and collaborator and co-writer,
Dan McClure.
And then joining us today, we have an additional colleague and collaborator who we're looking forward to getting his background. Jason, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm a current grad student at Fort Hays in the history program. I have a master's degree in English from James Madison University and a doctorate in higher education from Old Dominion University. I currently teach and have been teaching for almost 15 years, I think now, various literature classes at our community college. And I usually focus on, which was my specialty at JMU, was Southern literature and Western literature. And so my thesis was on Truman Capote and the Southern grotesque. And I published work about Toni Morrison, for example, just kind of all over the place in terms of the expertise that's going on there. But we've spent a lot of time over the last decade, at least, together as a group at our community college, talking about various Western pieces of literature. And as I'm always quick to remind the students, Western literature is kind of a misnomer. We also have to make sure that we call it literature of the American West, because there is a mythology at work there.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you so much, Jason. So now I want to kind of maybe hand it off to Dan to talk about. We have one more essay. One thing we didn't finish last week was that third section in our Wills and Wright edited collection. And so I want to talk about that, and then we'll move on and talk about your only piece of reading this week, which is the piece by Kwame Anthony Appiah, which is What Will Future Generations Condemn Us For? And then I'll talk a little bit about kind of general, how I think about and how I hope you are thinking about, ethics and moral reasoning in your everyday life. And then I think we want to kind of, zoom out, but also, I don't know, this isn't going to make sense, maybe zoom in and just think about, this whole course. How do we think about all of the stuff we've been talking about in relation to the West and the history of the West? How do we think about the history of America? How do we think about how this is represented in different kinds of fiction, including literature? And that's going to be how we kind of end today. So, Dan, why don't you start with your own kind of thoughts and reflections on the Will's piece about the sublime and mundane?
Yeah, so it's sort of fitting to end with Will's piece at the end there of the Red Dead book, Sublime Reflection and Mundane Realism in Rockstar's Historic West. And really it's, this concept of mundane realism, right? How far specific repetitive tasks coded into digital simulations are similar to or map onto real life tasks. And I think this is important, especially since, most people playing the game are, definitely drawn into the natural scenery, whether it's, hearing all different kinds of birds, wind, different kinds of animals I never thought made noises. Like I now feel like I know what a noises foxes make. Again, it's through a video game, right? So you kind of have to put brakes on being an expert on the noises of animals. But I think the fact that the game allows you to consume the environment and sort of as if you're, in the deep end of a 12-foot pool inside looking up, I think is probably the main aspect of the game people come to appreciate. But the other part too, and I think this goes back to the history, is we were talking about this last week with Richardson, it's the idea that the West itself was always this image to be made, right? And it's significant too that, because if the West is when we think of the West, if it's really just a part of westward expansion, and we could go back to Frederick Jackson Turner and think about, the initial colonies as being the West, right? But when does the West start? And if the West sort of begins somewhere around the mid 1800s, somewhere maybe the moment that there's the Louisiana Purchase, right? Where does it become the West? There's an argument to be made that the West really begins with like modern technology of documenting things. So photography, like, do you have the West before photography, or does photography help define what the West is? If photography kind of somehow, floats to the surface in the 40s, 50s, 60s, especially after the Civil War, how much of the West is really just an image of the West that we now take as the West? And that was sort of something that was going through my head as we were reading Will's, this idea that, it's a loop, it's a feedback loop.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Dan. I do think that there is something really interesting about this idea of, that image of the West with, with these kind of, vast, sweeping, kind of panoramic ways to look at nature and to think about how this is really recording. I think it's interesting, as to think about it as much a kind of creation or fiction as just recording what's there. I think that's interesting too. Go ahead, keep going. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, I mean, the other one that we've talked about this a couple of times is that John Gast painting, American Progress from 1872, right? And obviously, the paintings have been around forever, but even outside of sort of photography, you have this sense that is the West, right? Like, the West is not the right hand side, the eastern part of the country, right, where you see like cities. The West is this section that the light of civilization is beginning to encroach upon. But at the same time, exactly the way that the construction images in the 1800s, especially through photography, right? You do select what you're going to take pictures of. So even within that construction of the image of the West, there are choices made to what do you put in, what do you not put in. And I think, at some point in the essay, he writes something along the lines of programming teams made choices as to what to include, exclude, and emphasize in their historic West, right? And if it's 1899, you're already 3 years past Plessy versus Ferguson, which takes place in New Orleans, so Saint Denis. How much segregation do you see in the game? How much is it emphasized? That was the question as soon as I got there in the game. Like, okay, how are they going to do this? How are they going to deal with explicit racism, right? So you do have the eugenics guy that you can go up to him and there's a police officer right there, but you can go right up to him and execute him. Everyone will run away. I think that's just a natural reaction if a gun goes off in the game. But the policeman does nothing, right? So you don't become wanted. And so they do sanction sort of the execution or murder of white supremacists. And then on the other hand, is you have the Klansmen that you come across periodically, and they're kind of bumbling, comical figures. I mean, the Lemoyne Raiders is the closest you get. I mean, I'd have to go back and pay closer attention to how much issues of race they're talking about. I feel like if they would have been a lot more explicit than they should have been, I feel like that would be in my head. But there's this balance going on of what are you going to show, what are you going to exclude. There is some realism, there is some segregation, but it's light, right? And I'm sure a lot of this has to do with gameplay, right? Like you have to have this thing sell. If not,
so whether it's exactly gameplay, at the very least, it's something like, we want to have a game that like people are going to want to play and enjoy. And depending on, how much our focus is on historical accuracy, then for a lot of people, the game is not going to be very enjoyable, right? And you might also think, certainly in Rockstar games, there is a lot of focus, or at least I think it seems this way to me, that there's a lot of focus on giving you kind of like moral agency, but it's always to a certain extent, right? So, in this game, there are just certain things you can't do, right? You can't, for example, interact with and kill the natives on the reservation that you see, right? And presumably that's like a conscious choice. One of the writers of our essays suggests that the only real reason for this is because those people are needed for a later part of the gameplay and story. But I guess I also thought that there's a real possibility that part of what the game designers are doing is thinking, if we let this happen, there's going to be some edge lord who's playing this game that's just going to want to kill all of the Native Americans just to kind of recreate, I don't know, the genocide of Native Americans. And so I think there's probably a lot of stuff going on to prevent and restrict that kind of thing. So you have moral agency, but it's all kind of curtailed up to a certain extent.
Yeah. The other part too, I think, and playing it the second round again, the idea that, like, so okay, you're in your camp, you go talk to someone, and you got to go somewhere. In your head, it's like, oh, okay, I need to go to X. It's going to take like 5 minutes on your horse, looking at a map. I keep having to go to the map. Do I turn left, to get to this location? Sometimes if I'm daydreaming, I'll go by it inadvertently, and then like, oh, I missed it. So I had to turn around and go back. I think that's a brave aesthetic to make players do too. And it's funny in here, there's this where he lists some of the journalists that are criticizing the game. We were saying it was monotonous, so big it feels like a chore, or exhausting in practice. It drags you through the mud and makes you do boring, tedious things. Which is funny. I think in hindsight, this will be the age of instant swiping and clicking. Here's a game that forces players to, you're going to have to ride to get there, and it's going to take a while.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jason.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, my experience personally, I played the game when it first came out and worked really hard to be an angel, essentially. Did everything good, gave people money when they asked for it, rescued people when they needed help, begrudgingly rode them back to town if I had to, all of that stuff to max out my honor. And I remember in 2019 and 2020 enjoying it quite a bit. This time around, while I was playing the game, I decided to do the opposite thing. And so if somebody was riding on their own or the stagecoach on their own, they'd get lassoed off of it and tied up and left by the side of the road. I'd take everything else, everything that I could possibly do, to the point to where I had something like a $400 or $460 bounty in one of the states. So every time I woke up from camp, you had the warning on the map that there was bounty hunters coming for you. So I'd set up a sniper rifle, the rolling block rifle, and take out 3 or 4 of them and watch my bounty go up again. That was significantly less fun for whatever reason. And it seemed to be a lot more monotonous to me this time around. And I think I played it with enough distance between the 2 playthroughs that it felt relatively new again. So I don't know if the ethical path, or like a personal choice. And so like I'm more inclined to do the right, in quotes, thing. And so I'm more attracted to that aspect of the game and willing to continue on, versus I'm not really all that excited about like the Grand Theft Auto Call of Duty, shoot everything that moves sort of aesthetic. And so doing that in this game seems to be, to me at least, somewhat counterintuitive and not very exciting at all.
Yeah, and it's almost that, and perhaps that's a part of the game too, is, there is that hassle. Like, I think the first time I did it, somehow I got a large enough bounty that I had bounty hunters, but I was trying to get money to pay it off. I didn't have any money. And so every time I went to go do something, and I remember I was in the mountains and there's nowhere to go. Like, I was forced to turn around and go all the way back around. I mean, it took me 15 minutes to get to where I was going because I couldn't get through this spot because there were bounty hunters there, and I couldn't afford to confront them because it would just up the bounty. Again, is that, in terms of the realism, was it that hard back at that time to deal with that? Within the gameplay, the game world within Rockstar, do they do that to make it harder for, right? Like, it's like there's a disciplining thing going on, right? Like, when you play for like positive or good honor, there might be some, like, oh, you have to take someone back to town. That's the biggest hassle. And it seems like there's a smoother play, which to me also kind of fits into this image, right? So then at the end of the day, it's harder to, I don't know. It's kind of like, again, it's that feedback loop. The idea that the game's set up that way plays into this feedback loop of this mundane, right, realism that is still a constructed sort of image within the game.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. My response, or I guess maybe not response to that, but I remember thinking the first time that I played the game, and during the second playthrough, and especially on reading the Will's essay, I do really like the combination or kind of the contrast of having to do these really kind of rote mechanical tasks in a way that can be kind of unsatisfying or frustrating, which is just really common in all sorts of mundane tasks that we do in our life, right? I mean, unless you're a person who just really enjoys washing dishes is not usually fun to do, but like, you got to do it, right? And a lot of the sort of everyday tasks of our life are like that. But I really like the Wills, and sort of also just thinking about my experience of the game, how much of that is contrasted with these kind of, big kind of sublime experiences. So, Wills talks about Burke's discussion of the sublime, and it's been quite a while. So, Jason, you could maybe jump in here if I get this wrong, but I remember thinking about the sublime in like some literature classes as almost like this quasi, I remember the language suggesting to me this almost quasi religious experience with encounters with nature, and often, encounters with nature that don't leave you, feeling happy or fulfilled or better, but, make you sort of come to grips with, I don't know, the insignificance of your life or your role or something like that. And I do think, like, there's a real beauty along with a kind of awe, but in that kind of old sense where awe is, linked to something like often fear, in the experiences of the sublime. And I do think that, I mean, there's a reason why the developers and designers of the game make it so that basically anytime you're, clopping along on your horse, that you can just go into cinematic mode, because it is so just visually stunning. And what's visually stunning is not, it isn't like a sci-fi game or a game where there's this beautiful glittering cityscape, like maybe kind of, Cyberpunk 2077 or something, but that, what you're doing and what is sort of the source of beauty that you're looking at in the game is this kind of, rich and varied natural environment. And the kind of contrast with that, sometimes can evoke an almost religious experience or sensibility with the, experience of chopping wood, or, picking another herb or something like that, right? Where what you're doing doesn't maybe have that feeling, and it feels more like drudgery or work, or kind of the everyday things where discipline is needed. I thought that was just a very it's an interesting part of the game, and I appreciated Will's kind of contrasting that. And then the discussion of the digital sublime is something I hadn't really thought about either. So I think that was my kind of reaction, and the thing that I thought was most interesting about the Will's essay.
It's interesting that you bring that up because I'm thinking about more modern games, and I know this is relatively recent, but there's been sort of a boon recently in games that are so, what I would say, boring, but focused on domestic tasks to the point that you reach an almost zen-like state. And so, like on Steam, for instance, there's a game called Unboxing, where it's like literally you pick up items and you put them away. And it's got tons of great reviews, and almost to a T, all of them say that, it's meditative, it's something that's calming and relaxing. And so I wonder if the reviewers that are cited here, I don't know if we're willing to say that Rockstar did this on purpose. But I wonder if the reviewers here kind of missed the point that for some of the fans of this game, the sublime isn't necessarily in the 3D recreations of peaks and valleys and so on, but rather in, combing your hair or picking out an outfit or something like that. And I think one reason why they enhance the natural beauty is at some point in time in the game, you come across Saint Denis, right? Or Saint Denis, however they want to pronounce it. And the first thing you see is like a massive smokestack, right? And I think they really amp up the natural beauty in an effort to kind of get you thinking in a more environmental manner. It's almost like Emerson is on the production team, a rock star or something like that, the transcendentalist and so on, trying to enhance the natural beauty by showing some of the scars that are on it as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, and I think that's a good point. I I have not heard of the unboxing game, but I am familiar with the kind of explosion of like simulator games, even for things like, farming simulator or trucking simulator or like bus driver simulator. And I have always found it just incredible that people love those games so much, because they clearly do, right? They sell very well and they're reviewed very well. And I guess my own experience of a lot of those tasks. I mean, certainly, you can reach a kind of, Mahalia Csikszentmihalyi flow state kind of thing if you have certain kinds of repetitive physical actions. But often, at least in my experience, those things are things where you're producing something, not just, doing dishes. But, you can kind of get lost in doing dishes, right? The physical things you're doing are so rote and repetitive that it can allow the mind to wander in a certain way. So I think what you're saying is very thoughtful and apt. I will just express my own kind of astonishment that some of those games are just, I mean, people, there's no question people love them, but I always just, my own reaction just is puzzlement. I guess I just don't understand that part of that experience very well. I have a friend who, has a very nice garage and is always tinkering, is very mechanically adept and inclined. And, I mean, I've seen him, take with a big winch, like an engine out of a vehicle, and take it all apart. And he just works on every piece. And then he does machining. So he machines stuff for it. And I know when there was like a mechanic or garage simulator that came out, and he loved playing that. And I just thought, you could go actually do that. Like, it's literally like 10 feet from you. And I know you love to do it. So I guess it makes sense that he would love to do it virtually. But I don't know. I think there's something really interesting about that. So I'm glad that you bring that up, Jason.
Yeah, it's funny because it seems like games are going in that virtual reality direction, right? As soon as they can figure out how to not make people car sick in it. So Red Dead has that. Like, I could only imagine what it'd be like playing that, right? With a VR set and being able to look around, to be able to turn and like shoot at people that are coming after you. That type of thing. But so on the one hand, it's it has its toes in that direction. But if we're looking at this systematically, like there's a reason why people are playing those mundane games. Like it's, if anything, it's isolating you in that moment. Like you've escaped the noise of your reality, but you're allowed to do the mundane, and you're allowed to unbox something without interference. Like my kid plays that trucking game, and the Kansas one came out a couple months ago. So he literally can go through haze. And to me, I'm just like, how do you play that? But for him, who's 18, that works. So it's almost like the game kind of has its, it's very much of the moment where it's pointing us towards this, the sublime of, you enter the game and you don't want to leave, but at the same time, the very human, mundane part of, sometimes you need to do those mundane things to feel like human, or to reconnect with the humanity of doing boring, repetitive of things there. But so do you want to take us into the Appiah piece?
Absolutely, yeah. So this is our only formal piece of reading this week. This is your last week of the class, and you have the kind of big history paper where you're bringing a whole bunch of stuff together. So we really wanted to make sure that you have the time and the effort available to do that. And so we didn't want to distract you with too much additional reading. I chose this piece or Dr. McClure and I chose this piece for several reasons. One, it's really short. It's also, kind of provocative and interesting. And I think, part of what we're interested in this class, at least I think that I'm interested in, is thinking about, how do we make moral judgments across time? And I think you can do that. I don't think that, there are people who I think, have this view that it's always anachronistic or somehow improper or inappropriate to take contemporary practices and apply them, or contemporary norms or standards and apply them to past times. And that's understandable. Certainly, we want to recognize when people are in a given time that at least some of their opinions, that it wouldn't be surprising that they are consistent with broader opinions, social, moral, political, otherwise, of that time period. But at the same time, I think, I think it certainly is okay for us to look back and say, as Appiah notes, right, the first two or three examples he gives, right, include lynching and slavery and domestic violence. And I think it's very intuitive for us, and I think appropriate for us to look back and think, yeah, those are real, obvious, areas of moral error or of immorality in past practice and in social activity. But I think that, it is very intuitive and common for us to think, and I think I'm sure that every generation roughly thinks something like this, that, those poor people from 50 or 20 or 100 years ago or 200 years ago, they were such fools about morality and about science and about society, about human nature and human psychology. But we've basically got it right. We just need to adjust a few things, right? It's very intuitive for us to feel that way. But I think that if we really want to be reflective and thoughtful about our own ethical commitments and our own behaviors and sort of the actions and institutions of society, we do want to, maybe try to think and kind of stretch our mental muscles and think, in 100 years, in 50 years, in 200 years, if humans still exist and are thinking about stuff like this, what would they look back on and look at our generation and think, oh my gosh, I can't believe they thought something like that was okay. So I think that's a really interesting kind of thing to do. And the other thing I think it helps us do, one thing I want to do, and I hope has this class has helped you do, is, we want to kind of help you develop what I would call your moral imagination, right? And so you probably have some kind of basic ideas about what's right and wrong or how morality functions. I mean, at least that guide your life and they guide your interaction with others. But, hopefully by engaging with these different ethical theories and kind of thinking about moral reasoning in a more in-depth way, what I hope has happened is that's also just helped you kind of stretch your moral imagination, think, okay, like how might I think about morality? Could it be, is it systematic? Does it need to be systematic? How do I fit these things together with intention and consequence, behavior, action, et cetera, right? And so I hope this piece too just helps you kind of further develop and stretch your moral imagination by just getting us to think about, if there were people in the future, what might they think of our practices? And so, Appiah underlines 4 different ones. He suggests there are kind of 3 signs that a practice is destined for future condemnation, right? People have and have heard arguments against the practice. As he notes on the first page, the case against slavery didn't emerge in a blinding moment of moral clarity. It had been around for centuries, right? Often people that defend the custom don't offer moral counter arguments, but they either offer practical arguments or just tradition, right? This is the way we've done things. He includes human nature there, although he doesn't really give any examples of that. So we might think about that and include that, but it's certainly something where some metaphysical stuff about kinds of human beings or human capacity is certainly used to justify certain kind of unethical treatment. And then he says, third, supporters engage what you might call strategic ignorance, which is you might avoid truths that force them to face the evils in which they're complicit. So thinking about, I always think about this. I think everybody, I'm guessing most people now have a smartphone. I know certainly there are some people that just get flip phones, and I have a few, even know a few people who just don't have any cell phone at all. So if you don't catch them at their house or their place of work, you're just kind of SOL. But I mean, having a smartphone, having a cell phone is really widespread now, right? But for the most part, the conditions under which those things are made and the metals used for them mined is really horrific. And so we could, of course, ignore that, or we could just at least think about it and maybe, if possible, help it guide some of our decisions. So the point of this is not to make any particular person feel bad or whatever. And of course, you might disagree with some of the things that he highlights. But what I really want us to do, and I'll mention those 4 things, but what I really want us to do in the course, and maybe even in the podcast, is just think like, what kinds of things might we think that people in the future will look back and think, this is a real significant social and moral kind of gap that we think about. So the 4 things that he mentions the prison system. He's talking about it in the United States. As he mentions, his mother, who was English, spent the last 50 years of her life in Ghana, and that's where Appiah's father is from. And he certainly, in other works, talks about his understanding of his kind of Ghanaian identity. But a lot of this is really about kind of, contemporary Western industrialized society. So if we think about the prison system, he's very clearly talking about the prison system in the United States, about, the kind of injustice of that, how often people are in prison for, nonviolent crimes, and how he doesn't talk about this, but a thing that we could also mention is how disproportionately imprisonment falls upon minorities and the impoverished. He talks about industrial agriculture and meat production, about just sort of the kind of conditions that you see. And he also notes that, you have someone like Bentham, right, who we talked about when we talked about utilitarianism, who said, the moral question is not whether animals can reason or whether they can talk or think, but whether they can feel, right, whether they suffer and can feel pain. And it doesn't take too much exposure to, the conditions in industrial agriculture to think that it's pretty horrific, even if you, just kind of grin and ignore it. I had a philosophy professor of mine who I really liked and who I thought was really, really smart. And he basically just said, I just don't really want to look at that because I kind of know where that path is going to lead me. And I think it's just going to be too hard or something like that, right? So the third thing that he talks about is the elderly, the institutionalization and the way that sort of elderly people are treated in many Western countries. When I talk to students that I've had that, are from China and grew up in China and have their family in China, it's still really common for people to kind of all live in the same house for generation to generation, and you have a real kind of filial responsibility. And sometimes that is taken too far, right? Sometimes you can see examples of this filiality that's taken so far where parents beat their 20-year-old children, and the individual just doesn't do anything about it because it would be unfilial or inappropriate. But at the same time, there does seem to be something really unsettling about, if you've ever been to a nursing home or a care home for the elderly, or if you've worked in one, many of those people, even if they have families, their families never visit, never show up, and don't seem to be very engaged with their lives. They're just kind of thrown away. And then he also talks about the environment, that it's not like this is something we don't know, but it does seem like we are leaving generations after us with a real serious mess on their hands. And to a certain point, maybe even after a few generations, or maybe 5 or 6 or 100, I don't know, I'm not a climate scientist, is something that is just uninhabitable for creatures like us. So, but again, what I really want you to think about, and what I hope this piece helps you think about in connection to the rest of our course, is just, how do we think about contemporary practices? How do we think about our own actions? How do we think about moral reasoning? And this, I think, helpfully leads to a broader part. So I'll say some other stuff, and then, Jason or Dan, if you guys have questions or thoughts, please jump in. But, in my view, the whole point of an ethics course, an ethics course isn't really trying to teach you, at least from a philosophical point of view, an ethics course isn't really trying to teach you, how to do the right thing, or what kind of person to be, or even, what is the true ultimate account of morality, if there is such a thing, right? There is a view of like moral education, often tied in with like religious communities, where that is the purpose of that kind of thing, right? I teach you ethics because I want you to become a better person. I kind of think that's true, right? I do think teaching ethics to students is about helping them become better people, but not in the sense of, I've told you about, utilitarianism and I think it's right, so you should too. It's less about that. It's more about what I really want you to do is start really thinking and reflecting carefully about ethics. Ethics, I think sometimes people associate it with these big life or death situations, right? It's about murder, and it's about theft, it's about slavery, it's about torture. But I think that a much broader view is that ethics is involved in a huge portion of our lives, in just our everyday lives, right? It's how you interact with colleagues and coworkers and service workers, people that serve you at restaurants or service you by, coming into your house and fixing your plumbing or your air conditioner. It has to do with how you treat family members. It has to do with how you treat, if you're, employed in business, coworkers and clients and customers, human interaction as a whole, even when the stakes are not as high or not as extreme as torture or as trolley problems or, Sophie's Choice or these moral dilemmas, or as high stakes as in our game, right, where there's like a lot of murder and you got to save the gang and stuff. There's a lot of ethical action all around us. And so what I hope that the course has helped you do is just think a little bit about, what do I think? Because again, that's part of what I want you to think about here. And what I think both myself and Dr. McClure want you to think about is, you probably have some moral views, right? You have some views about what's right and wrong, probably some views about where that comes from, if anywhere. You have some views about how it applies and when exceptions can occur. You probably have views of whether you have different obligations to family members and friends and other people. You have all kinds of views that we could kind of put in this big constellation and package and call it like your ethics or something. But, a lot of times as we develop those, sometimes they're developed on the basis of experience. Sometimes they're just sort of inherited or taken from parents or teachers or priests or peer groups. And I think that a lot of our views are kind of like, it's like osmosis, right? It just kind of passes to us from other people, but it's not a matter of like careful selection or reflection or engagement. And I hope what this course has done is just give you the tools to do some more of that. It doesn't mean that necessarily after you get through this course, you're going to go, oh, all of my beliefs are totally different. I've done, a 180 and I don't believe all these things. I believe these new things. But regardless of if any of your views have changed, hopefully you have a better sense of them. You've maybe subjected them to some scrutiny. You've compared them to these systems that these people who are very smart spent a lot of time really trying to carefully develop. And we should use those things, right? We don't want to reinvent the wheel. If people have been thinking really carefully about something, let's see if there's something there that's still applicable that would help us, right? Update our own views of life. And I'll just give you a personal example. When I was in grad school, I think I've come to a number of kind of, I guess, ethical conclusions based on sort of studying and thinking about ethics and arguments in ethics. But In grad school, I spent a lot of time studying Chinese philosophy, in particular Confucian philosophy. We did some study of Taoism and Chinese Buddhism, but a lot of the people I worked with were Confucius specialists. And so, um, a real focus in Confucianism is filial piety, right? Shao, Xiao is the pinyin romanization. And, this idea that I have like certain obligations to my family members that are really important, especially my mother and father, but just to my family members in general. It's not like I didn't think that was true previously, but when I thought about that and kind of became exposed to it more and considered some of these arguments and these views, it had a real definite impact on me, such that I thought, it's not like I was being a terrible son or a terrible brother to my sister, but I was not really doing a great job, right? And so it was thinking about this and really engaging with this that made me think. I think the Confucians or Neo-Confucians or whatever were convincing that I should take that more seriously and that should be more of a focus in my life. And I think that can happen when you encounter all of this, whether you encounter it in a formal article or whether you're just thinking about it on your own. I hope that part of what this course has helped you do is just think about moral reasoning and ethical theorizing, both in terms of reflecting on yourself, on understanding other people, and on seeing how it's depicted in games and stuff. And being able to apply some of those theories to analyze situations, I think can be really helpful, even if you don't endorse or adopt any particular one. So that's what I guess I have to say about the Appiah piece and kind of our whole discussion of ethical theory and moral reasoning here at the end of our course. Dan or Jason, do you guys have any thoughts or extra things you want to chime in with, or questions or objections or anything like that?
Yeah, I guess I think you hit it with right, the thinking about ethics, right? Not necessarily how to be, but and I think Jason too, with the education background, like, I mean, really any class is meant to, you're going to get content. Doesn't matter what class it is, you'll get content. Some of that content you might know, some of it you might not know. But the point of the class is always to make you self-conscious and to place order on what you already have and upgrade, or I guess from construction, it would be retrofitting, right? Retrofitting your existing sets of knowledge with the inclusion of new sets of knowledge. And then, right, the ultimate goal is being able to reflect on that. And then when you leave the class, like I've always said this with, for students who want to do work on film, especially film. I guess we could start saying this about video games too now. If you want to do work on film, be prepared to give up watching films with the sort of awe that you had, at least for me, when I was 10 and saw Raiders of the Lost Ark, and be able to enjoy films as a roller coaster ride. Because once you start studying films, every single thing you watch, it doesn't matter what realm, you're gonna use the tools and sets of knowledge that you've been accumulating to look through it. So it's like, you're interested in film, I love films, or if you study them, be prepared to stop loving film in the way that you used to. I would say that's probably for literature too. Like and I've kind of come to the conclusion that there's certain things I don't want to know about because I don't want to lose that. I don't know what those are now. Video games, we can throw that out the window at this point. Because every time I play a game now, like I'm also playing Fallout,
Yeah.
we've had conversations about Fallout and maybe doing writing on Fallout and stuff like that. But it's like, it's once you're self-reflective or self-conscious about it, that's it, right? Like your engagement changes, and it's impossible to get back out. It's good.
Yeah.
I'd say you should take that path because life's too short, but be prepared to lose the innocence, right?
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. And Jason, I'd be interested to hear your perspective. I have at different times in my life. I mean, I don't disagree with what you're saying there at all, Dan, or at least not mostly. I guess what I would say is like, I think there have been times in my life where I couldn't, quote unquote, flip off of the philosophy switch. And I tell you what, if you want to lose friends and alienate your family, there's hardly a quicker way than to subject everything they say or every reason they give to the standards of academic philosophical scrutiny. Good luck maintaining a normal human relationship if you're doing that, right? And so, and David Hume, he actually talks about this. He famously he wrote about moral theory, but he wrote about causation and induction and a bunch of other things. But one thing he says, which is very funny, but it's also something I try to remind myself of, and I've tried to really be better at is in finding a balance. Is he says like sometimes you're going to get lost in all of these kind of philosophical conjectures, and it's going to really radically affect the way you look at other people and the world and yourself. And then he says, but sometimes at the end of the day, basically you just got to go down to the pub and play some backgammon or snooker and just like just be a human being in addition to kind of being a philosopher or something, right? And so I think that what you're saying I think is right. Like I do have a hard time, I have a hard time not turning on kind of the philosophy switch, whether that's in thinking about video games or ethics or anything else. But I also do think like the whole point of doing all of this theorizing, the whole point of it, the service of it should be to serve like living a full, flourishing human life, I think. And that is going to have to include getting outside of that overly intellectualized, overly reflective part and just go like, enjoy the company of other people, even if they, make fallacious arguments sometimes or incautious with their language or whatever it is that philosophers or historians or literary theorists might dislike. So I don't know. What do you think, Jason?
Yeah, so I've not really had much success in turning off that engine. I know when to shut up, which is good. But even for these video games that we were talking about earlier, like the simulators, one of the things after I read the Appiah essay is like 100 years from now, will we be accused of being blue collar cosplayers? Like will we qualify ourselves for a different economic experience because we played a video game and delivered a truckload of goods from Dresden to Berlin, that sort of thing. And so there's
That's
definitely
really good. That's a good example. Yeah, keep going. So,
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, like, there's definitely a vibe in many cases of the need for people to shut off their brain. And so, in 2016, I think I published a book with a small press, academic press, that's called The Kaiju Film. And it's all about kaiju. It's Godzilla, Gamera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was an academic breakdown of some of the I guess, less fun aspects of it. And a part of that has meant that I'm a part of an ongoing conversation, willingly or not, in various spheres. And some of the conversation is essentially that it's not a fun thing anymore. And so for the new Godzilla films, for instance, like the one with Godzilla X Kong or whatever that they called it, it's bone deep dumb, basically. And that's fine. And people like it for that, and that's fine too. But there's also this sense that something big is missing along the way. And so as we think about like popular culture and entertainment and stuff, I think one of the big losses that we've had in 100 years from now is the sort of pervasiveness of thought-provoking material in our popular culture. Like, and I think most of us, or all of us in this podcast, are Gen Xers or close to it. Even our 1980s songs sometimes had some pretty deep stuff going on in them. Like think about 99 Luftballons, for instance, and so on. Red Dawn in our films. We can look back at those and say, that's some serious stuff that's going on. We can sit down, even Raiders of the Lost Ark, we can take colonial, viewpoints on it and so on. The stuff that's coming out now, for instance, that's super popular, I'm not entirely sure that material is there. Like if we think about our biggest blockbusters, our superhero films, Avengers, and so on, things go boom, basically. And that seems to be the underlying thesis for those films. Not to say that they're bad or that they're unenjoyable, but that they're ultimately hollow. And so turning that back to Red Dead Redemption 2, like one of the benefits for that is that accidentally or not, it does provoke discussions about the American West. It provokes discussions about violence and the role of violence. And I remember, that when it first came out, there was a huge discussion about the Ku Klux Klan. And the fact at the time, I don't know if they fixed it, but the fact at the time that if you interrupt a Klan meeting or kill Klan members, you get positive honor. Whereas if you shoot a cow, you get negative honor, right? And so from some moral perspectives that fits and others it doesn't, basically. And so that sort of depth, I think, and again, you bring up Fallout as well, and I played 3 and 4, that there's depth to that, in terms of power relationships, gender, colonialism, all those sorts of things that are there. That I don't think are popular anymore, like in the realm of popular discussion. I don't know, maybe I'm just being too old in my perspectives, but it certainly feels that way.
Yeah, it's always, the kind of difficulty about knowing when your impressions of, current things compared to past things are really legitimate. How often are you the I mean, this is an old reference, but right, it's like the Simpsons thing, right? Old man shakes fist at cloud kind of thing, right? We want to try to avoid that. What you mentioned there is really interesting. A thing that I was thinking about too is how sometimes, like in some games, you can have the games kind of play with moral expectation. Like I was reminded that in Fallout 3, there's a quest where there's, I can't remember the names. There are these wealthy people who are in this high-rise building, and they have like guards and stuff, right? um, and they're very explicitly kind of bigoted against ghouls, and your ghouls are not allowed to live in the, what is it, penny something towers or something like that, right? And so obviously, like, the good thing for you to do is, even though some of the ghouls like are very aggressive and mean spirited, obviously what you want to do is, like, at least what I did, but this is when the first time I played the game, I was like, well, look, you can't just not let these people in because they're different than you. That'd be wholly inappropriate, right? And so you do various kinds of persuasion checks and other checks to persuade people, and then you can eventually persuade the people to let the ghouls in and live alongside them. Well, if you come back to that later in the game, you find out the ghouls have killed everyone that's not a ghoul. And so it's like, even though it's a good action, the game kind of complicates that ideally initial good action by you come back and going, oh, this did not turn out how I would have expected it to turn out, right? I did the right thing, and still this thing occurred. That just made me think about what you were saying, made me think about that, Jason. Sorry, Dan, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I mean, to me, that the Red Dead, why, I'm attracted to this Red Dead, the game, in the sense of even, doing the class, is precisely this, the depth to it. It's troubling, right? The fact that you're able to have agency here and there, but then, especially, I mean, the strawberry one's probably one of the worst, where you're forced to just kill multiple people just so Micah can get his guns. And you're not given the option to allow Micah to just rot and then be hung, which would solve a lot of the problems that unfold in the game, especially because, the spoiler I won't say, but, and so I think that's a part of that thought-provoking part, is you do have agency, but it's like they force your face into, dealing with certain things, and suddenly you are now a part of the problem. And the fact that Red Dead is so popular, there's that little bit of optimism, and I'm not a big fan of optimism. But in this case, like, wow, that's pretty optimistic, because, I mean, it's probably not as popular as it was, but what's that game, Fortnite or something?
Yeah, Fortnite.
Yeah, where it's just like, I remember, my one of my kids was playing it. I'm just like, what's the point? Like, it's just a free for all, and then there's one winner. So it's like this kind of, again, too much. You can't enjoy anything. But it's like it's a zero sum disciplining, right? At the end of the day, it's everything is zero sum. Um, but then you go to Red Dead and you're forced to do certain things. There's this mundane element, and the fact that it is popular. I could imagine a different alternate reality where Red Dead 2 is very much favored by critics, but is not popular because it doesn't have this spoon-fed candy uh, element to it. Um, my brother and I were, we've been playing Fallout 76 for a couple years now, and have made a couple friends on there that we meet up. We don't even know who these people are, but we've been playing with them for a couple years. Um, and then we both went back to Fallout 4 a couple months ago, and both of us are like, wow, Fallout 76 is this Disneyland version of what was that famous park in New Jersey, Adventure Park or something like that, where it was this. There's a documentary on it. It's worth watching, but it's like this park with shouldn't have been made. There's multiple deaths, injuries, versus Disneyland, which is the super safe. Um, I don't know. I don't know. There's yeah, it's I agree with Jason about some of this pop stuff, like, but on the other hand, like Revenant comes out and you're just that movie sticks with you. Interstellar. I mean, talk about you better bring a lunch and a gaming diaper, right? Like that is a long movie, but I remember the first time I saw it in the theater. For weeks, I was just thinking about it. It wouldn't leave my head. Um, just yeah, I think we're in a weird space, and maybe there's always been that. Like some of those movies from the 40s, 50s, and 60s are just dumb. So maybe that's just a part of right consumerism. Sometimes you just have candy corn, and then sometimes you do have $1,000 bar or something like that.
So Dan, this is a good. So I guess I want to bracket this part of our conversation by saying, um, I hope both of you find the switch, because I'm telling you, I don't know that I've found it necessarily. I do sometimes, as Jason, as you said, I sometimes can't turn it off, but I can bite my tongue. But I think sometimes I have found a way to turn it off, and I don't know, things are more enjoyable. So there's a lot of joy to be had if you don't think too deep about stuff, especially if you can, right? It's good to find that middle ground. But the end of our discussion here, I think, it makes me think about just how do we think about all of this in the context of the content of our class? So how do we think about history and the American West and America as a whole? What do you think, Dan?
Well, going back to Richardson's talking about that Owen Wister who wrote The Virginian, and he says something along the lines of, it's not just an American story, but it's an expression of American faith, right? And then you obviously, when you're playing the game, Dutch is constantly, don't lose faith, and so it's I can't not think that there's a connection, right? That would be a good interview for the researchers for the game. How much did they go through the Owen Wister and kind of pull on that little line there, but then zooming out a bit further, right? The West then isn't really a story; it's a faith built off the image of the West, which right? The West isn't really anything. It's a concept, but the concept can't exist without these images of the West that give the concept some sort of depth, right? So the photography and the painting. Um, but if that's what the faith is built off, it's built off a construction, right? And so there is this strange kind of haunting sense of, if the West has all this, or the process of the West, maybe better put it better, put it in a better like sense of, how reality unfolds. It's a process. Um, the idea of the West, and I'm thinking here of, the legacy of Western films. Um, it brought up this James Baldwin quote from, I think, No Name in the Street, where he says, William Faulkner is seeking to exercise a history which is also a curse. He wants the old order, which came into existence through unchecked greed and wanton murder, to redeem itself without further bloodshed, without, that is, any further menacing itself, and without coercion. This old orders never do, less because they would not than because they cannot. They cannot because they have always existed in relation to a force which they have had to subdue. This subjugation is the key to their identity and the triumph and justification of their history. And it is also on this continued subjugation that their material well-being depends. Right? So it's, like, how do you make a game that is realistic? It is easier to go into the future, right? Think of Star Trek. Think of, any like science fiction where there's some sense of all the problems that exist in our time have somehow dissolved, right? Or to go into the deep past, right? Like classical ancient history where there's just different issues happening. And so you can, delve into that world, but, the recent past 500 years, you're walking through a lot of landmines that still have there, we can still feel their reverberation. And again, it's not like it goes back to, you can just enjoy the game. I think it's, you can still enjoy the game, but it's going into it being a bit self-conscious about it, right? I think that's, the big sort of what you can pull out of it is this sort of self-consciousness of, the game has to be this way.
Yeah, I thought that the Baldwin quote that you had there was really interesting. Especially just thinking about the game and how it kind of depicts or thinks about, America, which, even in the game, at times it becomes pretty clear that what they're thinking they're going to do, which is find some piece of land that isn't yet, owned by anyone, or maybe used to be owned by someone, or maybe ownership doesn't right come into it, where they're going to be able to kind of live in their own way, free from the trappings of civilization, but still have them. I think even in the game over time, it seems like that does become more like a myth, more like a story Hosea is telling himself, for example, or Dutch is telling everybody, than something that is really, going to be realizable for them. So I think that's yeah, that's good. That's very thoughtful.
Isn't there the Tahiti, right? Isn't that South Pacific?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's and again, I don't know if this is the wink, but you have, right, 1898 Spanish American War, the US sort of expansion into the Pacific, Hawaii, Philippines. So it's, again, I think, again, this is that thought provoking. That's not an accident. You they could have went to Chile, surf during the day, ski in the evening. Um, but yeah, no, I enjoyed that.
Well, the Baldwin quote is interesting because that ties into sort of the broader genesis of Southern literature. Of course, Faulkner is probably the most famous Southern writer, if not one of the most famous writers in American history. And in the early 20s, we had this movement of artists called the Fugitive Agrarians. And they collectively wrote this book called I'll Take My Stand. I think it was 1922. And it was about a dozen old white guys, basically, who never really got too much traction as writers. So people like Andrew Lytle, who wrote The Velvet Horn, Robert Penn Warren's probably the most famous of them for All the King's Men. John Crow Ransom was a published poet, but no one really talks about many of them very much anymore. And in all of those essays, there was this push to bring back the American South with capital S, essentially. The notion that the Union had come in, Reconstruction occupied the South, stripped away its identity, stripped away the way things were, and so on. But if you read these essays, there's some huge stuff missing. Slavery, for instance, upon which their entire economic well-being was placed. And so, of course, I'll preface this by saying I'm in Virginia now. And so in Virginia right now, I think we're very much kind of Southern. It depends on where you're at in Virginia. There's more Southern places and more not Southern places culturally. And there's this whole discussion about the idea that the South will rise again, or a book that my father, who was a Confederate Civil War reenactor, had, that the South was right, right? And those books are still out there. And I'm not too far away from a small bookstore that sells all Confederate stuff. And they have all of these tiny vanity published books that are predicated on the notion of the fugitive agrarians, if they don't know it, that they are, that the South was never wrong if you remove slavery, which they completely, ignore for the most part. But there's this sort of apologetics that goes on, and you can go to this little bookstore and pick up this small self-published book, or this book that's by this tiny press with a run of like 500 or something like that, and they're very much convinced about creating the valor of the generals and Confederates and so on. And they'll take like a quote from Abraham Lincoln out of context and write an entire essay on how Abraham Lincoln was pro-slavery, all these sorts of things to try to bend the narrative a little bit. And so for Southern literature in particular, that's really what is wrestled with since the 1920s, is like, how do we recreate a Southern society in which everything is in its correct place again, without discussing slavery and the implications of that. And so, as we saw with West from Appomattox, like a lot of the ties between the American South sort of moved, and the discussion sort of moved to the American West as well. And so, as we think about the American West, a lot of it, especially in the 1880s and such, seemed to be predicated on mythology already. And so I was reading a book called Cattle Kingdom by Christopher Knowlton. And he very much pointed out, like, if you take a look at the records, most of these towns, even mining towns, which were considered to be rough and tumble, had very low murder rates. Like Dodge City, single count murders, right, over the span of multiple years and so on. But what was happening was that various rival newspapers in various towns were sort of jockeying for a position to get people to move to them. And so they would post these sort of fantastic accounts of this sort of violent encounter that occurred two towns over, in an effort to get people to make them think that their town was safe. And of course, then we have the background of tuberculosis, and that in 1882, we already knew it was a bacteria. And so there's not really a cure for that, but a lot of towns are sort of advertising their fresh air, their sanitariums and stuff as things that would get you really close to a cure. And so when we think about our immigration to the American West, a lot of it's sort of based on falsehoods as well, as sort of detract or subtract, I guess, a lot of the stuff that we don't want to talk about. So in this case, of course, genocide of the Native Americans, the massive cullings of the buffalo herds, all of the things that would sort of leave a black eye on American history, we remove and then hope that the good stuff sort of sticks around at the same time.
Yeah, I keep thinking of, and we're the same age, Mississippi burning, right? So if you know nothing about civil rights history and you watch Mississippi burning, you leave like, wow, the FBI were really on the right side. And and the laws that are kind of hitting states too about what you can and can't teach. Right. So it's it's funny because it seems like a very American, and maybe this is all over the world, but a very American thing in the sense that, everything's freedom, equality, liberty. How do you tell these uncomfortable parts of the past that are systematic and that so many people were part of? Like, keep thinking of lynching photographs, right? The whole town is there and they're dressed up. Like that's something deeper than just a spontaneous murder of someone, right? Like that's woven into the same way that you would sing Christmas carols at strangers' houses. Like there's a moral bond that happens with those types of things. But again, you kind of want to take those things out as you're retelling the past in the present. Yeah, definitely seems like a recurring pattern, which is that right. Again, for Rob, like it's almost like it's being combed through the ethics of what should we take out and what can we keep in. We want the hero stuff, but we can't. We don't want to have a bunch of. We don't want Mr. Rogers as a crime against humanity type. Right, that would hurt us if a figure like Mr. Rogers is depicted in that way, even if it was true. Right, Mr. Rogers isn't anywhere near that. That's just
Yeah. So this is interesting. I guess I'd be curious what you both, or maybe what you both think about this, or maybe you could help me think about it more. I think that, I mean, I guess I generally feel like, and this is my kind of my reflection right now of the past, many years of my life and my education. But I guess one thing that I've at least appreciated about my education, both when I was a student at Fort Hays a long time ago, and even in the public schooling I got in, was certainly there was not a lot of time and effort that was spent talking about, for example, lynchings. But I feel like, and again, I understand this is definitely still a continuing point of controversy. I think all the efforts about what you can and can't teach in K through 12 education, and the way that, for example, Florida, their education department is basically saying yes to certain textbooks and no to others, in part based on, it seems like, the depiction of slavery in the United States. I guess I always felt like, I got, at least to some extent, and again, this is part of, had to do with, like, I'm sure, high school and college education and just talking to people too, but I feel like I certainly recognized the role and significance of slavery, and continuing problems with, like, Jim Crow and racism and sexism. And part of that, I think, is, I always find it curious when people want to, like, I certainly know people who basically don't want to really talk about the fact that presidents were slave owners or other things. But I guess I wonder, like, for me, the way I try to approach all of this is, I guess I would really like for us to be able to, for human beings in general, to be able to acknowledge, like, all of the facets of people. So when I think about, someone like Benjamin Franklin, I want to think that, this guy was, like, insightful and very thoughtful and really contributed a lot in a very positive way. And also, was a terrible womanizer and constantly cheated on his wife. I guess I don't know whether or not Benjamin Franklin owned slaves, but I would assume just at this point in time he probably did. Certainly Jefferson did many good things, and also certainly undoubtedly, like, kept slaves and raped a number of his slaves. So it seems like all of those things are true at the same time, right? And part of really understanding any human being, I would think, if we want to do it in a way that doesn't, you know, turn them into just heroes without any kind of, you know, problem, or that just turns them into pariahs that we don't acknowledge anything good, like a full kind of, I would think like mature accounting of any human being is to take all of those things into account and recognize both the sort of benefits and the real, you know, black eyes or negatives about them. You know, I always think about this when I think about, well, I mean, you know, you can pick just about any figure in history. So I teach a world religion class, and so we spend 2 weeks on all of the big religious traditions, and we talk about like both contemporary and older kind of religious figures. And I think, we talk about, for example, the Dalai Lama, who isn't like the head of Buddhism. A lot of people kind of think that's like he's the president of Buddhism or something, and that's not true, right? The Dalai Lama is the head of a very specific sect of very specific group of Tibetan Buddhists. But anyway, the Dalai Lama, I think, has done a lot to advance the cause of Buddhism and to sort of fight against the Chinese oppression of Tibetans. But if you pay attention to the news, there was a super weird thing like 2 years ago where a video came out where the Dalai Lama is like talking to this little kid and asks him for a kiss, and it's just like, oh my God, like this is super weird. So all of that is true, right, about the Dalai Lama. It isn't just that I think, we see this weird interaction with this kid, so we just go, well, that washes away or makes irrelevant all of these other really good things. And we don't just look at the good things and go, oh, well, he's an old man, let's just not worry about it. It seems to me that like, a full appraisal of any human being is going to try to be fair about all of those things. And because human beings are so multifaceted and almost no human beings are one-dimensional caricatures, whether that's good or ill, I don't know. I would think that would be like, I want to do that, at least for me personally. When I think of both historical figures or periods of time, I want to think about, what real benefit was there and what real advantages accrued because of that. And also what horrific, immoral, awful things occurred because of that too. I don't know. What do you guys think of this? Do you think that that's possible? Do you think that isn't really possible? Do you think that's, I don't know, somehow naive of me? I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, I mean, I think that's the way, at least doing history, right? That's sort of I don't want to say fun, but, that's the challenge. Like when I teach it, I get the problem with like both teaching, writing is we're stuck in a linear mode, right? So when you go to write, you start a couple sentences in, and then all of a sudden you come to a, more than a fork in a road, and you need to talk about it all at once, but that's impossible. So then you have to prioritize where you go. But then that's where if you brought a bunch of authors in a room, they would all have a different opinion on where to go in that. Same way with teaching. I'm probably notorious for going off on a tangent because at that moment I feel like, we need to talk about this before we get over here. And then half the time I'll forget. Like, wait, what was I even talking about? And so it's, it's and to me that's human, right? I think that's that, like, if you go back and think of like oral transmission of stories, it's all about rhythm and, and so it does evolve, but, it sticks to sort of this pattern that someone can hear it and then they'll take the baton. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I teach the founding fathers, it's like, yeah, good words, but we need to understand the words in the context of their lives, the economic system they're living in. We were talking about like Kant, right? Like, how do you, you would have to do extra work if you're a European in the 1700s or especially the 1800s, when science is telling you that scientifically you're a superior being. How would you not be born with sort of these ideas of race and gender. Like you would have to work to get out of that. Right?
Sure.
Take effort. To me, that it's like I always it's not Miles Davis never said this. I think he said it, but he didn't come up with it. I can't remember who did, but he always talked about like it's not the notes that count, but the space between the notes. And that to me is when we do history, like that's what you're looking at, like the space between the notes, the tension, this moving gelatinous liquid that somehow pulls everything together, but it's an impossibility to try to explain it within a linear way, right? So, and then that's the task. Like, how do I give this language? Right? How do I describe this thing that just happens, but how do I give it language to be able to communicate that to someone, right? Which it makes our job, you're never done.
Sure.
Reading, your writing is never done. You stop writing when the due date comes and you have to hand it off. Which I guess I'm at peace with that, because that's the process. Like my favorite word of the last 20 years is process. Like everything's a process, right?
Sure.
Because Jefferson also said, I mean, there's that quote, if there is a God, we're going to pay for what we've done.
Yeah.
That goes to that whole, it was the times. Like, no, they were thinking about this.
Absolutely.
But, it's sort of, and I always think about that with eating meat, right? Is the ethical thing today, in terms of the environment and all this stuff, is the ethical thing to become a vegetarian, right? What would that do with, the land dedicated towards meat, dedicated towards feeding meat? Is that the best route? But then you're also then you're destroying the livelihood of
absolutely.
And who are you to say, right? Like it's a very messy ethical choice that there are losers and winners all over the place. But what is the right answer? And then what, we can defer it for the next generation.
Sure.
Which to be the
It's interesting that you brought up Thomas Jefferson, because I'm about an hour away from Monticello, and as an elementary school student, we had like annual pilgrimage there, and so I guess I'll contradict myself a little bit from my earlier pessimism, but one of the nice things about Monticello now is that when I was a kid and I went there, there was barely any mention of slavery whatsoever. There was a little segment there where the slave housing had been, and there was a plaque that said slaves lived here, basically, and really nothing else. And so about a year or so ago, I went there again, and I was actually kind of blown away by the revamping of the entire story of Monticello itself. They didn't really go too much into Jefferson other than Sally Hemings and the possibility that's pretty well established of him having children, or somebody in a genetic line having children with her. And they focused really on like, here's where the slaves lived, right? Here's where they would have worked. They would have pumped this amount of money into this type of economy. He was like, creating all these types of wine, and in order to do that, he needed this number of slaves and so on. And so it became less of a story that was worshipful of Thomas Jefferson and more of a story of a place and time that still probably has room for improvement, but is much more rounded, I suppose. And I think one of the things, especially when you teach literature, at least for me, but I'm sure when you teach history as well, is that I always bring up the relief, basically, like the negative aspect to the prevailing sentiment of the time period. And so when we think about slavery, for instance, we can go back to Benjamin Lay, right? Our Quaker radical thinker going around kidnapping people's kids and hiding them in caves to, get them thinking that slavery is bad, all those sorts of things. And for literature, when we think about literature of the American West, it's always been interrogated, the mythology of the West. Willa Cather has done it. Bret Hart has done it. Really sort of worked with ideas of gender, power dynamics, and so on. But we have these big titans that we're constantly sort of orbiting against. So Zane Grey, Louis L'Amour, Elmore Leonard, right? And literature. In cinema, John Wayne, right, is sort of the big planet essentially that everybody else is sort of orbiting around. And so when we think about films like Unforgiven or The Wild Bunch, we think these are sort of new attempts to interrogate the West. But also at the same time, we also had High Noon, right? And Terror in a Texas Town, and Johnny Guitar, right? There's a bunch of films that are out there that they say, wait, look, that's not the way things were, right? Let's see if we can get to a closer approximation of the way things were. And it's just fascinating to me that we would have a film like Unforgiven, for instance, and then a film like Tombstone, right? Almost right up against each other. And Tombstone, I've always argued, is more of an action movie that's wearing Western clothing. But that sort of brings back the sort of romantic West sort of aspect. Whereas Unforgiven is over here, like a few years earlier, just interrogating the American West, but also Western cinema as well. One of the favorite parts that I have of Tombstone, and you may remember it, is after Clint Eastwood shoots up the bar or whatever, and the journalist comes up to him and says, "Oh, how did you come up with that? How did you know who to shoot first?" And Clint Eastwood's character says, "I just got lucky," right, or something like that, which is a direct callback to, I think it was The Outlaw Josie Wales, and the sort of more romanticized West, because the same scenario, Clint Eastwood's character goes into a bar, gets into a shootout, he shoots like 10 people, comes out unscathed. The journalist asks him what happens, and his character is like, well, this guy over here was standing here and he looked like this, so I thought I'd shoot him first, and like a scientific breakdown of everything that happened, and this fantastic mythology. And so for me, like as I think about a lot of the mythology of the American West, I constantly have to sort of remind myself that there were people during the era writing around the era. Like Bret Hart was writing 3 or 4 years and publishing stuff that was deeply critical of the mystique of the American West 3 or 4 years after the Civil War. And so I constantly have to go back to those writers and those figures and say, okay, there were people, right, that were around that were sort of puncturing that myth even back then.
Yeah, and that's a good way to kind of bring this in for a landing too. I think because isn't there what's the mission in Red Dead where you're basically helping to write a book, and so you have to visit the gunslingers, and they all, it's like they almost all of them are just these. They all got lucky that they were still alive.
Yeah.
And that's I love that insight, Jason, because it's like I just had no idea, but it really foregrounds like it's always been about this image, but even as the image is unfolding, you had people contesting it, and trying to what is the authentic West, which then maybe that's really the answer is it's what can you do to make something authentic that becomes the West.
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, so I guess we should probably wrap up. Dan, that was really good as a final thought, and Jason, I appreciate that too. Do either of you have any other thoughts before we end for our final podcast for our Red Dead History and Morality class? Okay. Well, thank you to everyone for attending and watching these. We hope that you've really enjoyed the class and gotten a lot out of it. So we will say goodbye now, but hope to see you in future classes. And I don't want to speak for Dr. McClure, but certainly you'll have my email at the end of this course. And even if you never take another class from me again, if you just have questions about ethical theory or just some general philosophy stuff or religion stuff, or you want to shoot me an email about video games or something, it's srbyer@fhsu.edu. Please feel free to keep in touch and let me know how things are going. So, all right. Have a great day, everybody.
Yeah.